Hello and welcome. Great to see you all here today. And we continue to be under the long shadow of the empire, as we say, week in, week out. And in particular, we're looking at where the courts that claim neutrality, for example, or justice have too often served as instruments of power. And tonight we're going to be looking at the criminalisation in particular of political activists by the British and Dublin governments, and how that is actually a pattern and it's not an accident, it's not a new phenomena. And we have to consider, take into account historically the use of emergency legislation to non-jury courts, and from expansive policing powers in the past and even at present to the the normalisation now of surveillance and body cams that were introduced to in Garda Síochána. So the law really has been used to discipline dissent and to protect the empire, or the political order and the interests that it serves. And of course, James Connolly warned us more than a century ago now that freedom can't be reduced to symbols or procedure, which is why it is still very frustrating to hear people in the 26 counties talk about Ireland being free or being surprised that the triple lock is going to be dismantled. Remember, James Connolly said, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organisation of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. So let's look at how the flag might have changed over the institutions in the 26 counties or in the courts, but the same injustice is reproduced and there's been no transformation. And a quote that came to mind when I was thinking about this evening was Bernadette Devlin in 1972 said, when we break the law, we go to prison, but when the government breaks the law, they change the law. And that's still the bitter truth today, and it exposes that the legal system is just manipulated and set up actually to criminalise resistance while laundering state violence through statutes, through judges and through precedents. So tonight's meeting is about naming that reality, and we're going to go to Barry shortly for a quick introduction, and also it is about standing in solidarity with those who are targeted for their politics, whether that's in Ireland or in England or any part of the world, for resisting imperialism. And we remember in particular, I want to name them tonight, the hunger strikers in Britain: Kessar Surha, Amu Ghib, Hiba Musari, John Sink, T. Huxa, Cameron Ahmed, Mohammed Umar Khalid and Louis Caramello, and hope I've pronounced their names properly. So ultimately we would argue that, Barry, I think that we have to insist on our right to organise against imperialism and injustice, that is resistance in itself, no matter how the law is bent to silence or to criminalise us. What do you think?
Well, resistance and criminalisation are kind of two sides of the same coin, in a sense. I mean, if the people decide to resist and they're resisting successfully and their cause is just, then power will automatically revert to criminalising them. And the most recent case of that has been Palestine Action, a completely peaceful group, nothing to do with violence at all, and suddenly they find themselves being branded as a terrorist group. Of course, that's because they are directly challenging the writ of power in Westminster, that is to say, the imperial power. And they were also challenging capitalism, because they were targeting one of the biggest arms suppliers to Israel, bar none maybe, Elbit Systems in England. So, and they had actually closed the factory as a consequence of continual protests. Now, they may wanted to have closed it anyhow, but the fact is they did. And it's not good for business when people are publicly protesting against your business, especially a business that's no doubt linked to the stock market and stock exchange, and prices can race up and down on a whim. But then, of course, criminalisation is not new. I mean, Republicans, the Irish people, in fact, in more recent years, Republicans have had first-hand experience of everything concerned with criminalisation at every level. Jury trials were done away with in the North, and the non-jury courts were introduced to try what they termed terrorists. That was a stage within the struggle that the scene they couldn't defeat because the people were supporting it. Then they tried to remove political status within the jails to try and criminalise not alone those in the jail, but to criminalise the struggle overall and to make it out to be a criminal conspiracy. And that had nothing to do with politics, and that had nothing to do with fighting injustice. That was just some kind of madmen that were, and women, that were carrying out so-called atrocities within the 6 occupied counties. And I mean, anybody that confronts power, and when I speak about power, I include all of the above: imperialism, capitalism, occupation, colonialism, Zionism. When you confront power and power feels threatened, power will do anything within or outside their own laws and will change their own laws to suit, and will automatically attack those who they see as a threat. And I mean, they will imprison you on any basis, and the normal rules will be just dispensed with at the stroke of a pen. And they will also kill you if they have to. I mean, they don't have any qualms about how far they will go to defend their system, and their system is capitalism, and that's what it's all about.
Thank you, Barry. The thing is that perhaps for some people who have really only become activists actually in the last 2.5 years, it maybe appears even more shocking or surprising, but there have been, not just, I'm talking about the arms struggle, but there have been examples of resistance across Ireland, or even in recent years, particularly with the housing activism, and housing activists who acquisitioned empty buildings were also treated very severely with the same brute force. So it's just important, I think, to emphasize that and to acknowledge that for all here today. You know, this is not a new thing. This has been happening, but of course it's never reported on, even though there's supposed to be court reports. It's never ever reported on, because, and very rarely would even the housing activists who find themselves in the criminal court, say in Parkgate in Dublin, for example, very rarely would the case escalate to the High Court, for the simple reason that if there was a jury involved in the decision making, they would probably be sympathetic to the cause and understand the politics behind it, and see that they're not petty criminals, they're not, that their purpose for their work is based and rooted in justice, actually, and political justice. So I think it's important to acknowledge that too, and many people might not know that. But also to come back to the Irish activists, while it's important to focus on the hunger strikers this week, absolutely imperative that we do, that we remember those who are still waiting trial or who are out on bail, and in particular the most recent example would have been down in Shannon at the Warport, and the 3 activists there, where there was an extortionate figure put on for bail as well, trying to set, as I said at the start, to set a precedent to put people off actually in direct action or resistance.
Well, even some of those English hunger strikers are already 2 years on remand, and there's some other trials is not scheduled to 2027. But you also see that here in the north. I mean, there's some people in the north here on remand for 7 years. 7 years on remand, convicted of nothing. And I mean, we have to be mindful of the fact too that the English hunger strikers have been convicted of nothing. They're innocent. I mean, tomorrow morning at the stroke of a pen, all charges could be dropped due to lack of evidence. But the other thing about criminality, the sort of the psychology behind criminality is, I believe, the peace process, which is actually a pacification process. I mean, many of you have heard me say this too many times. But the thing of it is, I mean, we all made a lot of people made great stir about this infamous, I would say, peace process. And all it meant was the absence of violence. But in fact, it was a pacification process organised by the British, the Europeans, the Americans, and the Dublin government. And what it done was it brought struggle and resistance within their parameters. It meant that it was a very bad thing to be involved in any kind of struggle for anything. As I said somewhere recently, if you were looking to protest against the price of a loaf of bread, you could be accused of threatening the peace process. I mean, it got completely ridiculous. And then, of course, there's a generation that has moved on now that has never seen struggle what we saw in the North, for example. So they don't understand what it actually takes to defend yourself against injustice. They don't realise that it takes you to do direct action. It takes all kinds of actions. It takes pickets, it takes protests, it takes all kinds of actions to hold power to account in any way that they can. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that affects both resistance and criminalisation. And all of them lead back to the one thing, that power wants to control the narrative. Power wants to ensure that people doesn't get above their station, that people suddenly think, oh, maybe we could take power here. Or maybe it is our business to see what way to establish what way the country is running and run properly. So they can't have that. So anything that they can do to quell or crush or put people in fear, and people are in fear. I mean, if people are working, people are afraid in their jobs because, I mean, part of job hiring legislation is that if you do anything outside your work that can be deemed to be detrimental on your company, you can be sacked forthwith. So people are afraid, and people have mortgages, and people have to pay bills, and all of these things are related and relative.
Thanks, Barry. And you even touched on that word violence. Like the violence might have disappeared, but again, that depends on the definition of violence. Not all violence bleeds or is seen. So the state violence upon those who have no homes, isn't that violence? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
People that again will never be told that was because of politics. You know, it's just unfortunate. It's just bad, and it's just a tragedy. Tommy, I'm going to come over to you now, just for maybe even a broad view. I don't want to maybe pin it down to a particular question, but on this whole topic of criminalisation and then looking at the hunger strikers right now, what's your view of the way things are going and even the trajectory?
I think it's a very worrying trajectory because we're down on the 44th day of the hunger strike for those on the longest period. 44 days brings people into dangerous territory because I've calculated that out of the 22 Irish hunger strikers who died from between 1917 and 1981, of those 6 died, actually 7 of them died within relatively short, less than 55 days. So take it that one man died after 33 days, some died 42, 40 days, and 50 and 50, 51 and 55 days. So by anybody's calculation, we're into dangerous territory here for those on hunger strike. The fact is that Britain has a long history of attempting to criminalise what is a freedom struggle. Keep in mind that as far back as O'Donovan Rossa was charged with sedition, breaking the law for writing articles critical of the British connection. And it's been a British tradition for centuries to attempt to criminalise resistance. And what's happening at the moment is in Britain, we're seeing a very concerted campaign against those demanding justice. 2 years of some of them have been on remand, and maybe another 2 years before there'll be a trial. Now, that's defying what the British tell us is their legal system, where there's supposed to be a presumption of innocence. In fact, this appears to be a presumption of guilt. A hunger strike really is something that's can ask for bail, to demand that basic right to bail, but that's been refused. Now we're seeing a complete media blackout of the hunger strike. The House of Commons is not energised about it. The Home Secretary refuses to meet with any of the spokespersons for the hunger strikers, and it's been downgraded. The whole operation has been downplayed. So we're seeing a conspiracy against those in hunger strike, those in prison, on one hand, and we're seeing the hypocritical use of British legislation on the basis that, for example, we're told that David Lammy is a process of abolishing jury trials for those to be charged with offences up to 5 years, carrying out up to a 5-year sentence, that this is some aberration in British justice. I've noticed that Daily Telegraph is complaining bitterly about it, and Michael Gove has wrote a couple of months ago an article in the Financial Times lauding the process of British jury trials, all of course omitting the fact that jury trials were abolished over 50 years ago in the 6 counties, which is technically are supposed to be as British as Finchley. So the British are dispensing with jury trials, or dispensing with bail, the presumption of innocence. It could well be the thin end of a wedge, and criminalisation is happening because the protest against the British complicity in the genocide in Gaza is instead being translated into and transferred over, and the British state is attempting to lay the blame and responsibility on Palestinian action, people who have taken action to highlight and to stop, if possible, Britain's collaboration with the genocidal Netanyahu regime. I leave it at that.
We'll come back to, I think it would also be important to look at the demands that the prisoners have, because I think there still is a little bit of confusion. Some people think it's just like release the prisoners, but they have specific demands, and they have 5 demands, just like the hunger strikers of 1981 had. They're not the same demands, but even can you see what parallels could you see, Tommy, between the demands of 81 and the demands of the activists today?
Basically, they're demanding recognition of their political commitment, and very clearly they're asking for end to censorship, and also highlighting that they wish to see an end to the British connection with an Israeli arms company in Britain, 2 of their demands, and the right to bail. Broadly speaking, we're talking here about the rejection of criminalisation in both cases. Now, how the demands are made is one thing, but the fact that underlying it all is the fact that they're rejecting the process of criminalisation. In fact, if there's any criminal element in this, it's the British state, not those that are campaigning against Britain's blood-stained record in Palestine. So this is a cruel, hypocritical trick to deflect the attention away from where it should rest, with the British state and its involvement is complicit in the genocide in Gaza, and transfer the responsibility of attention onto those that are complaining, that are acting against it. That's the underlying point, and I think that's the obvious connection. It's the politicisation of their stance, which has been rejected or been denied by the British state.
And Tommy, you did say this is, and I think everybody who's outraged, who wants to do something, who's making now the hunger strikers the main focus of, say, the grassroots campaign. There's a real sense of urgency around this, and you have stressed like 6 people throughout the history of the 20th century who went on a hunger strike here. Irish political prisoners died before 55 days. You yourself were on hunger strike, and you spoke about this before, and I think even on other platforms in Britain. And I know this is very personal, but just for those people who are wondering like what it's like, can you even explain the physical, mental torture of a hunger strike? And I know it's very painful. I hate to ask you, but I think people do want to know what are the conditions like for someone on hunger strike.
For a start, no human bodies are identical. So different people have experienced different trajectories, downward trajectories. Basically, the bigger and stronger a human is, the longer they last, or the better their chances of survival are. Now, as far as I know, several of these prisoners are small. A number of them are female, which I don't know them individually, but I can assume that there's probably not enormously powerful, huge frames. The fact is that what happens is I feel like it's a process, a downward spiral that happens. First, people feel cold because without food, the body gets cold. Then, bit by bit, the body starts to take away from the human body is a very sophisticated piece of machinery. It works through the least important parts of the body right through to the most important. So it starts with fat, then muscle, then it'll go to the organs, and eventually it'll go for the heart and brain, which is the fatal piece. But something that has to be kept in mind is that if even a person doesn't die on hunger strike, there is the possibility that they might suffer irreversible injuries. Eyesight could go, kidneys, different aspects of it. In my case, what was happening was that I was gradually in decline. My kidneys were failing. Kidney failure means that the body isn't fit to discharge the natural fluids through the body and urine. Natural enzymes that the body has to break down food are not discharged through the normal functions, and they start to build up. There's a backlog of them, and eventually they'll come into the bloodstream. It'll affect the brain. It leads to breakdown in eyesight. It leads to coma, but it's a slow process at first, and then eventually it escalates towards the end. And it's impossible to predict how long anybody will survive or what exactly will happen to them, but there's a certain inevitability of the end.
Thank you, Tommy. I mean, that's deeply, it's nearly traumatizing hearing about the effects of that. And then as a survivor yourself, Tommy, how long did it take you even to recover when your eyesight went? When you did, I know you were only hours away from death yourself.
Initially, about 6 to 8 weeks before I was reasonably recovered, but then it takes several years before. But what happens is the optic motor nerve is impacted. That means, in other words, that the control one has over their eyes, move up, down, left or right, is impacted. For years afterwards, I could find out, especially if I stood up fast or sat down quickly, that my eyes would go up and down, float up and down. I lost control of them. But at one stage, for a number of days after, for a couple of weeks after, I had practically one eye was blind, the other was short-sighted. So it would take about 6 or 8 weeks before I was fit to walk without help.
What an incredible story. I mean, that's only 2 or 3 minutes summary of it, and what the ultimate sacrifice and the endurance there. So right now at this moment in time, this is what our fellow humans who dare to challenge the imperialist system are going through. And like you said, they are presumed guilty until they're found innocent. And it looks like the system was set up to make sure that they will not be found innocent, which means that if the law system, Barry, over to you, we're looking at the courts. If Bernadette Devlin said that when governments break the laws, and go, they change the laws to suit themselves. When we do, we end up locked up. If the laws are changed, or for example, the proscription of Palestine action, that was a very serious step to set a precedent. What then can the people do rather than feeling, because you could feel despair if you were to focus just solely on the physical conditions or the mental conditions of these people, and to see humans waste away. It's very upsetting. But what must we do instead? Barry, what is the charge?
Well, it's encouraging to see the thousands of British people who are actually defying that piece of legislation in Britain. We sort of think that we're the only people who are defy anything that Britain ever says. But it's interesting to note that people of all kinds of classes within nationalities within Britain are openly defying the ban on Palestine action. And way over 2,000 people have been arrested, and I don't know how many have been charged or what. I mean, it's big numbers. And it doesn't seem to have deterred the people from expressing their complete abhorrence ruling. Because, I mean, it goes to the heart of, in fact, anything to do with protesting. I mean, to walk down the street and hold a flag or a placard, or stand on the side of the street and hold a flag or a placard protesting against something, could, in theory at least, and probably reality too, become a terrorist offence. So how far are we off dictatorship and autocracy? Not too far, I would say. The mask keeps slipping all the time.
Would you consider like that the current Dublin government, or I don't know where this is at now currently, but whenever the new coalition government was formed, one of the first things that they were proposing to introduce was the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And that is still on the cards, like that hasn't gone away. If that's adopted as a definition by the government, it'll have ripple effects across the workforce. What I didn't realise until recently, so that's another form or another way to criminalise those who express any disagreement even or protest against Israel. That's part of the IHRA definition. But oh yeah, in Britain already, even though the government hasn't adopted the definition, the NHS has, which is why you see that there's a number. And again, this is going, talk about media blackout, Tommy, like you were saying, this is going under the radar as well, where healthcare workers are under attack. And if you think about like the targeting of healthcare workers are very well respected across the world, whatever system they belong to. They're seen as essential workers, and workers who have also that sort of empathy and compassion, and that they're motivated for the common good of society. So if you target a big cohort of workers, or scare a big cohort of workers like in the NHS, the public service, and try to criminalise those workers for speaking out against genocide or expressing anything anti-Zionist that can be misconstrued as anti-Semitic. That's a clever move, is it not, Tommy?
Yes, it's a very clever, sinister methodology that the British have long centuries almost of experience of doing, and misdirect the situation, misdirect the attention to change the focus from one side to the other. The fact is that this is happening for decades, if not centuries. We're seeing the total overlooking, ignoring of the situation by the media. Not only the hunger strike, because you see, the hunger strike is one thing, which is the most serious aspect of this situation at the moment. But fundamentally, it's the underlying question of whether British justice, if such a phrase isn't an oxymoron, because they have perverted what they describe as their own rules of law and have done it throughout their empire for centuries. But what's happening now is that it's coming home. Misbehaviour there throughout the empire is now coming home right to the heart of the empire, to London. As a result of what happened in Palestine, I mean, but Britain created the state of Palestine, state of Israel, not with any thought of mercy or concern for the Jewish people and their horrible suffering, but to create a a human garrison for imperialism in the Middle East. And now this tragedy that they created is coming back to haunt them. And they're determined not to have it examined, because if their role in Palestine was examined from top to bottom, if it was explored, and now their treatment of those that are protesting against their complicity in the genocide, that it would expose their corruption and their complicity, as I said, in genocide. Now, the fact is that we've got to keep in mind that the British people, by and large, are human beings the world over. They're decent, they're honourable, and if they were to hear the truth, they would not tolerate it. I suppose the one thing we can take from this is that human beings and human nature being what it is, that in Britain, that if the truth were told, we could rely on the decency of the British people, the British working class, to change the situation. So that's why this distortion of the truth has to be perpetrated. I think maybe if there's any bright side to it, it's the fact that they're telling lies, that they're distorting the truth, is to ensure that the decency of the British people can't emerge.
I think another part of that too is that all of this resistance, both in Palestine and around the world, is questioning the so-called world order. It's questioning bourgeois democracy. And the more crazy pieces of legislation, although they don't see it that way, that are introduced to silence people, actually has a detrimental effect. Now, it may take maybe a number of years for the outworking of all of this to translate onto the streets or into the public mind fully. But translate it will. World democracy, so-called, and the whole world order and imperialism, along with Zionism, has been seriously questioned. So that's a positive. Now, it's a terrible price. It's a terrible price on the Palestinian people. It's a terrible price on the hunger strikers in British jails. And it has been a terrible price throughout the history of struggle. You can't even measure it in that way either, because it's a slow grinding process that can take maybe hundreds of years or more to translate into something even more positive.
Thank you, Barry. Just a quick update. Somebody asked, is there any update? Yes, we had Tommy did speak about how critical the conditions are for at least 3. If you've gone over the 40-day or marker, it's extremely critical, and that 6 Irish hunger strikers over the course of the 20th century in Ireland actually perished under 55 days. So this is serious, and intervention is urgently needed. I'm going to end on one last sort of general question about Ireland's response to the British hunger strikers. Or maybe not even Ireland's response. The response, actually, I would say, it's more obvious coming from the Republican base. I wonder, would you agree with that assessment? When we look at who's mobilising, who's responding first, who's educating, who is seeing the urgency, and who's prepared to talk even about the hunger strikes. I would have to say, from my own experience, looking around and going, who's not talking about the hunger strikers and who is? And I would have to say credit to the Republican base in Ireland for doing that. Is that a fair assessment, Barry?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, of course, it comes from lived experience, horrible and all as it is, but that's the reality. I mean, it was the reality during 1881 hunger strikes. The 26 county ruling class and their media packs done all in their power to distort and ignore the hunger strikes at that time, because again, they see the danger. They realise that these things are arisen people, that people are getting up off their knees, that they're not prepared to accept the nonsense. And the exact same thing is happening with the hunger strikers in England at the present time. It's déjà vu. I mean, the hunger strikes, even in 1881, the 80 hunger strikes got very little coverage, relatively speaking, until the Tommy and his comrades became seriously ill. Then they started to talk about it. And then there was a hiatus between that and March 81. And it wasn't until Bobby Sands was nearly on his deathbed. Well, I suppose he was kind of different in the way that he was up as an elected candidate, election candidate in Fermanagh South Tyrone. So that sort of generated anything they could do to distort it, or propaganda by omission was used. And it'll be the same for the prisoners in England at the present time.
Yeah, because I think it's still in the living memory of many people who are
Absolutely.
still active, like whether that's the embassy protest where the people went on the rampage. There was absolute talk about resistance, madness, and outrage towards the British government at the time, to then those historic pictures that we still footage of Bobby Sands' funeral, the huge funeral, you know, they are nearly iconic. But that's the problem, Tommy. Like, people play great rebel songs and talk about Bobby Sands very romantically in the same way as they do James Connolly tied to a chair, this kind of emotional attachment and a romantic attachment. I know it's important to harness all feelings and attitudes and not dismiss anybody's response to what's happening. But what would you say, from a principle point of view, is the correct response to what's happening?
Well, it's very difficult to predict or to prescribe what should be happening, but obviously we need a bigger mass movement in Britain where possible to get the maximum number of people motivated and mobilised. There are over 40 MPs have raised the issue, so that's something, and I think it has happened since the start of the hunger strike, has asked questions. Now, they're not getting answers, but at least it's something. But one issue that Derry and Strabane District Council has put forward a motion supporting calling of support for the hunger strike. And because of the nature of the local government system in Britain and the North, all, whether we like it or not, within the United Kingdom, it means that the motion will be passed right across every council in the United Kingdom. I think how we could help is if we know any of our relatives or friends or contacts in Britain, to ask them to try and put the pressure on their local councils and MPs, whoever they are, to put pressure on, because Britain, the state will not have no concern whatsoever for the lives of hunger strikers, either their lives or their well-being. So what they're going to do is, hopefully, that the hunger strike will either end without any concessions, or the hunger strikers will pass away without any attention being given to them. So the thing is to put the pressure on the British state to embarrass it, to bring it, that it has to pay a political price for what's happening, beyond moral outrage, which is obviously understandable, but we've got to try to get political pressure put where it counts. And one possible aspect is to focus on the egregious position of British injustice, that they tell us how they abide by the rule of law, and it's a rules-based society. At the same time, the rule of law is adjusted, changed to suit power. I think we've got to focus on that and highlight that as well, that this is not just cruel treatment of prisoners, but it's a huge abuse of the system of law that Britain claims to focus on, so that they have to pay a price in terms of their standing and their position.
Thank you very much, Tommy, for that analysis and what needs to happen from a political perspective and what we can all do. But thank you very much to our panelists, Barry Murray and Tommy McKerney of the Pat O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, and to all here watching live and who might be watching later on Catch Up. Thank you.
Carmen.
Thank you.